Welcome to the MVTI Learning Channel. My name is Enoch Opong, your English instructor. Our topic is clauses. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to define clause, identify the two main types of clauses, and write at least a sentence with the types of clauses. Let us move to our lesson. What is a clause? A clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb. Let us take a few minutes to explain the words in our definition. We are saying that a clause is a group of words. What it means is that a single word cannot be a clause because it has to be a group, meaning there should be two or more words for a group to be a clause. A single word cannot be a clause. First of all, a clause is a group of words. Secondly, we are saying that it should have a subject. A clause should have a subject. A subject is a person, a place, thing, or the idea that is doing something in a sentence. And we know what a subject is from our previous lessons. We are saying a clause should be, first of all, a group of words. Secondly, the group of words must have a subject. The third part is that the group of words should also have a verb. Then we know that we do have a clause. A clause, therefore, we are saying is a group of words with a subject and a verb. Let us look at some examples of clauses. 1. James climbed the table. James climbed the table. First of all, we realize that our example is made up of 4 words. So, it is a group of words. Secondly, we can clearly identify a subject in there, which is James. The third condition we discussed was that it should have a verb. And in our example, we have a verb there, which is climbed. Let us look at another example. Linda is preparing food. Linda is preparing food. Is that a clause? Yes. It's a group of words. We have a subject in there, and we have a verb. The subject is Linda, and the verb is preparing. Let's look at another example. Essie cried. Essie cried. Is that a clause? Yes, it is a clause. It is made up of more than one word, so it's a group. Obviously, there is a subject in there, and there is also a verb. The subject is Essie, and the verb is cried. So you see, just 2 words can also be a clause. Now, can you just put down an example of a clause of your own? I hope you wrote a group of words. Can you identify your subject and your verb? Well done. Let's now look at the types of clauses we have. The types of clauses are 2. The first is what we call the main clause, or is also known as an independent clause. Main clause or an independent clause. The second type of clause is known as a subordinate clause. A subordinate clause is also known as a dependent clause. Let us try and explain each of them. First of all, let's look at an independent clause, or what we also call a main clause. A main clause is a group of words with subject and verb that can stand by itself as a sentence. A main clause is a group of words with subject and verb that can stand by itself as a sentence. What we are saying is that for a clause to be a main clause, then it's possibly a sentence because it makes sense. In other words, we say it expresses a complete thought. It makes meaning. It's understandable. Let us look at some examples of main clauses. 1. Johnny is coming home. Johnny is coming home. Does this statement make sense? Yes, it does. Is it a group of words? Yes. Clearly, it has a subject and a verb, and it's expressing a complete thought. Let us look at another example of a main clause. Richie needs to study. Richie needs to study. This is also another good example of a main clause. It has a subject and a verb, and it is expressing a complete thought. Let us look at another example here. I finished the job. I finished the job. Another example too is he danced well. He danced well. We can see that all these examples we have there are basically major sentences. That makes sense. Let us look at the other type of clauses, which we call the subordinate clause or the dependent clause. What is a dependent clause? A dependent clause is a group of words containing a subject and a verb, but cannot stand by itself and cannot be a sentence. A dependent clause or a subordinate clause is a group of words containing a subject and a verb, but cannot stand by itself and cannot be a sentence. We are saying a dependent clause, yes, it's a group of words. It has a subject and a verb, all right. But when stated, it does not make sense. We say that such a clause has to depend on a main clause to add to its meaning. Thus, for a dependent clause to make meaning, it has to be used with an independent clause. A dependent clause cannot stand alone as a sentence unless it is used with an independent clause. Let us look at some examples of a subordinate clause. 1. Since Johnny is coming home. Since Johnny is coming home. If I meet you and I tell you, since Johnny is coming home. Since Johnny is coming home. You are waiting for me to add more information, right? Yes. That is a subordinate clause, a dependent clause. It is waiting for something to rely on to make sense. Let's look at another example. Though Richie needs to study hard. Though Richie needs to study hard. You are waiting for me to add more, isn't it? Yes. Let's look at another. Before I finished the job. Before I finished the job. And finally, when he danced well. When he danced well. You would note that all these group of words do not make sense, but they do have a subject and a verb in there. Why are they doing so? Because we have introduced certain words which we call subordinators. Let us look at our examples together again. If you look at our examples, you would realize that words such as since, though, before, and when are the subordinators that has been introduced to our group of words to make them subordinate clauses. For clarity, let us look at both together. Independent and dependent clause. An independent clause, we have said, is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb and expresses a complete thought. An independent clause is a sentence. An example is, Kofi studied in the room for his examinations. On the other hand, the dependent clause is a group of words that also contains a subject and a verb, but does not express a complete thought. A dependent clause cannot be a sentence. Often, a dependent clause is marked by a dependent marker word, which we are referring to as subordinators. An example is when Kofi studied in the room for his examinations. So when you look at these two examples here, you realize that just by introducing the subordinator, we were able to get a group of words that doesn't make sense, even though initially it was making a lot of sense. Let's look at some activities. Can you identify the independent clauses in the sentence? The sentence is, Mary called Bob and he gave her the next day's assignment. Mary called Bob and he gave her the next day's assignment. Independent clause 1 is Mary called Bob. The other independent clause in there is he gave her the next day's assignment. You note that this sentence contains two independent clauses, and it makes perfect sense. Let us look at another activity. Identify the clauses in the sentence. The sentence is, I decided to make jollof rice for dinner, which everyone in the family enjoys. I decided to make jollof rice for dinner, which everyone in the family enjoys. Try and identify the clauses in this sentence. You got an independent clause? Yes. I decided to make jollof rice for dinner is an independent clause. Dependent clause, which everyone in the family enjoys. Which everyone in the family enjoys. You would note that this particular sentence has one independent clause and one subordinate clause, and it expresses a complete thought because there is an independent clause in there. Now, let's go to the next activity. Identify the clauses in this sentence. Since restaurant food is expensive, even though it is delicious. Since restaurant food is expensive, even though it is delicious. Which types of clauses do you see in there? A subordinate clause? Yes. The first one is, since restaurant food is expensive. How about the other one? A subordinate clause? Yes. Even though it is delicious. Let us look at the sentence again. Since restaurant food is expensive, even though it is delicious. I am sure you are asking yourself, and so what? You are waiting for more information to be added. Yes. This is not a sentence. It is not expressing a complete thought. It contains two subordinate clauses and not depending on any other to make sense. Let's move on to the next activity. The sentence is, since restaurant food is expensive, even though it is delicious, we never eat out. Since restaurant food is expensive, even though it is delicious, we never eat out. We have introduced another clause to it. The first two, since restaurant food is expensive, is a subordinate clause. The second one, even though it is delicious, is also a subordinate clause. But now we have introduced a main clause to it, which is, we never eat out. Do you realize that now the sentence is complete? Just because we introduced an independent clause to two subordinate clauses. Note that without at least one main clause, a sentence does not express a complete thought. Without at least one main clause, a sentence does not express a complete thought. Now it's your turn to do some practice. The first part, you are just to copy and underline the independent clauses in the following. 1. I bought the book since I had the money. I bought the book since I had the money. 2. Even if he tried really hard, he will never make it to the team. Even if he tried really hard, he will never make the team. B. Underline the subordinate clauses in the following. 1. Mary is a great student, but she rarely studies. Mary is a great student, but she rarely studies. 2. Although we had heard the news, we refused to believe it. Although we had heard the news, we refused to believe it. And the C part is, write a sentence of your own which contains a main clause and a subordinate clause. I will join you in the next 5 minutes so that we will discuss your responses. I'm back. Let us look at your responses and work together. The first part was, underline the independent clause in the following. 1. I bought the book since I had the money. I bought the book since I had the money. The clause to be underlined is, I bought the book, and that is the independent clause. 2. Even if he tried really hard, he will never make the team. Even if he tried really hard, he will never make the team. The correct response is, he will never make the team. B. Underline the subordinate clauses in the following. Mary is a great student, but she rarely studies. The response is, but she rarely studies. The second one, though we had heard the news, we refused to believe it. Though we had heard the news, we refused to believe it. The subordinate clause in there is, though we had heard the news. C. You were to write your own sentence. Read your sentence to yourself. I hope you were able to put in an independent clause and a subordinate clause, and it's making sense. Well done if you were able to go through all these. Thank you very much. We have come to the end of our lesson. We have been discussing clauses. We said a clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb. We identified two main types of clauses: an independent clause, which is also known as a main clause, and a subordinate clause, which is also known as a dependent clause. Going forward, we were able to tell that a subordinate clause cannot stand on its own unless it is used with an independent clause for it to make sense. Thank you very much for joining me. We'll meet another time.